Supplying your own firewood for heat is said to warm you twice, the first time while harvesting it and the second time while burning it. Supposedly Henry Ford said that, but I bet you he never lived in Scotland. It's a cold country most of the time. I spent 2 years there living on a spiritual retreat center with dozens of other people from all over the world, and as a staff there, my job was mostly working outside. I helped look after the garden, and I also helped on the estate with some forestry projects, and I also took care of the animals that we kept. So our living quarters, they were all communal, and they consisted of a big Georgian mansion and some cottages and a dormitory that had been converted from an old stone barn. It was called the steading, and hot water for bathing and also for the radiator heat in the steading was supplied by burning firewood in this ancient stove that lived in a little cave on its own out in the back of the building. This thing had a door was hanging by one hinge, and it wasn't very efficient. But it was 100 years old, but we had to keep the thing stoked 24/7 in order to keep a constant supply of hot water. So that required a lot of firewood, and I was part of the estate team, so part of my job was to collect this firewood. So we'd go out on the estate, look for a dead tree, cut it down, chainsaw it into chunks, chuck the chunks in the back of a trailer, haul it with a tractor back to the steading courtyard where we'd unload it, cut it into smaller pieces, and then we'd split it and stack it. So the harvesting of the firewood definitely kept me warm, but the burning of it, not so much. My room was in the steading, but it was at the very far end of the building from the hot water storage tank, which also meant it was at the end of the radiator line. So by the time the water made it all the way through the building to my room, it wasn't so hot anymore. Plus my room was in the northeast corner of the building, which north and east happened to be the two coldest directions. Well, what about getting a space heater? Well, Braemar, that was the name of this place, was off the grid, and our electricity was supplied by two very unreliable propane-fueled generators that crashed all the time. So for this reason, we weren't allowed to use electricity-sucking appliances like space heaters, for example, and we also weren't allowed to use hair dryers or electric kettles. We couldn't have those in our room for making hot drinks, for example, because of these faulty generators. So these were all the things that had the potential to bring warmth into my life, but I couldn't use any of them. Another potential for bringing warmth into my life would have been the ability to take a hot bath. After a long, cold day working outside, a hot bath would have been a perfect way to end the day. But the steading didn't have any bathtubs, and the showers were more misty than showery, and it was always hard just to get the water temperature right. Adjusting the shower knob required a neurosurgeon's precision to get that perfect temperature somewhere between frostbite and steel forging. So you always either ended up getting scalded or you just had to make do with a lukewarm shower. Well, one day a friend of mine, Shane, and a fellow resident offered me the use of the bathtub in his cottage, which he shared with a woman and her young daughter. So I had to schedule my bath time for when they weren't going to be using it. Now this was going to be my first proper tub bath in a while. So to celebrate, I got some votive candles, and I got a loofah sponge, and I got some specially scented bubbles, and I packed my things in a little bag, and I trundled across the courtyard to Shane's cottage into warm, watery bliss. In the bathroom, I set the candles around the edge of the tub, and I lit them, and I turned on the cold water tap and the hot water tap, and I poured in my bubbles, and I took my clothes off, and I got in. Well, the water wasn't quite warm enough yet, so I turned off the cold tap to let the hot water tap catch up. But it never did, and the water never really got above lukewarm. Well, the only thing worse than being dry and cold is being wet and not as cold, but still not warm. So I gave up, realizing this wasn't going to happen, and I went back to my room in the steading, and I fished my illegal hair dryer out of the dresser drawer. And I lied down on my bed, and I just bathed in the warmth of that instead. Well, Shane offered again. He felt really bad about it, so he said, why don't you give it a try again? So the following week, I tried it again. I set my candles around the tub and I lit them. And this time, though, I only turned on the hot water tap, and I poured in my bubbles, and I got undressed, and I was waiting for hot water to come out of the hot water tap. And I waited, and I waited, and pretty soon my goosebumps were goose lumps, and I realized this wasn't happening again. So I went back to my room in the studying, got out my hairdryer, bathed myself in my hairdryer. The lights were flickering overhead. The generators were very upset. I didn't care. Well, a week later, Shane offered a third time. And being the optimist that I am, and a freezing cold optimist, I accepted. So this time, though, I was not going to get out my candles, and I was not going to pour in the bubbles, and I wasn't even going to take my clothes off until hot water was guaranteed out of that tap. I knelt down by the tub, and I gave the hot water tap the stink eye for a second. And I turned it on, and out came scalding water. Hallelujah! I drained that tank, and then I added cold water to bring the temperature up to tolerable, and I put in my bubbles, I set out my candles, I lit them, I ripped off my clothes, and I jumped in. Just as I was sinking beneath steaming wet perfection, Shane's roommate knocked on the door. I know Shane said you could use the tub, but this is our cottage and Nikki has to have a bath. Nikki was her 9-year-old daughter. Can you give me 20 minutes? She has to have a bath now. Really? I couldn't argue with her. It was her cottage, so I got out of the tub and I trudged back across the studying courtyard to my room. My wet hair was steaming and chilling me to the bone. Got out my hairdryer and I pointed that sucker at me like a large-barreled gun. For any of you who grew up with siblings or have ever had roommates, you know that it's moments like these where living in the woods like a hermit can sound like a really attractive option sometimes. Eventually, I started sneaking baths in the big house, that was the manor house, and I say sneak because technically I wasn't allowed to use the bathtubs there because they were only supposed to be for the house residents. Sometimes I got away with it, and sometimes I got told off for it. But I could never really relax in the tubs in the big house anyway because every time I would hear footsteps coming down the hall, I thought someone was coming to check me out. After about a year, I got to move into the big house, which meant I could take a bath legally whenever I wanted, but still an impatient person would hurry me along, or sometimes we just didn't have hot water. After about a year and a half of this communal living experiment, I started to get a little fed up with people, not just because of the bathroom situation, but for other reasons. So I rented a cottage up the road, and it had the biggest, deepest bathtub of my dreams and endless hot water. I could take a bath whenever I wanted for as long as I wanted without fear of Bacchus interruptus, and I did. I had music, I had candles, I had loofah sponges, I had a different bath bubble scent for every day of the week. Finally, I had arrived. Except I hadn't, because I lived alone and I really missed living with other people. That experience taught me that real warmth doesn't come from hot baths, and it doesn't come from chopping your own firewood. But real warmth comes from sharing your life with other people despite the challenges. Thank you.